I'm so happy to welcome A.X. Ahmad tonight. He's here to discuss his debut novel, The Caretaker, and this is his first talk about the book, so we're especially lucky to have him here for the launch. This is the first in a trilogy featuring his Sikh protagonist, Ranjit Singh, who's a former Indian Army captain who's come to the U.S. after a harrowing incident on the Siachen Glacier. In this book, he's a caretaker for wealthy people's vacation homes on Martha's Vineyard, including the home of a U.S. senator, and he finds himself caught in the middle of a potentially explosive international incident. I can tell you firsthand this is a terrific read. I have exactly 33 pages left myself, and I can't wait to get home to finish. But of course, that will be after we have a long and luxurious event tonight. Please help me welcome A.X. Ahmad.
So thank you all for coming. This is the first time I've ever done a reading, so I really appreciate your support. And before I start reading from the book, I'd like to tell you all about a quick story about a journey I made recently. It wasn't a long journey. In fact, it was about a journey of 25 steps. As the crow flies, the distance I covered was about 10 feet. Yet this journey took me 3 years. I want to repeat that. It took me 3 years to walk 25 steps. And let me explain. About 3 years ago, I moved to DC, and I was working on a novel. I didn't have an agent. I didn't have a publisher. All I had was a big stack of unfinished manuscript pages. And at first, I tried writing in my apartment, but that was too lonely. So I started to go to this bookstore that had a cafe. I'd get a cup of tea and sit at the table in the remainders room in the basement and write. I spent so much time in that basement that I got to know the booksellers by sight. I spent so much time at that table that once the booksellers had a staff meeting there and someone handed me an agenda. I spent so much time down there that at Christmas time, when they set up a gift wrapping station, the ladies wrapping the presents asked me to help them with their ribbons. So down there, I had good writing days and bad writing days. But when I felt discouraged, I told myself that all I had to do was travel from the table in the basement to the main book-selling floor above, a distance of about 25 steps. And that thought kept me going. Well, as many of you have guessed by now, the bookstore I'm talking about is the one that we're in, Politics and Prose. And the table where I wrote this book is pretty much directly below us. So 3 years later, I finally made that journey of 25 steps, and I'm here reading from a finished book. And without Politics and Prose, there probably would have been no book. So this is a very special place for me, and I'd like to thank Susan and Sarah and all the booksellers who make this a wonderful bookstore, and more than that, a community resource. On to the reading. I'm going to read from three places in the book. And hopefully I won't be giving away too much of the plot. That's a problem with writing a thriller. It's hard to find things to read. I'm going to start first with the prologue, which is pretty self-explanatory. At 19,000 feet on the Siachen Glacier, there is no longer earth and sky, just an endless mountain of snow. In this infinity of white are 6 men walking in a line, moving in the drunken lockstep of the exhausted. They wear white snowsuits over their Indian Army uniforms. Heavy assault rifles are slung across their backs. Their lips are split and bleeding, their eyes hidden by snow goggles. It is quiet up here. The only sound is their ragged breathing. The soldier at the end of the line is a gangly 19-year-old. He hums tunelessly, then begins to sing, his voice growing louder. Loaded like a freight train, flying like an aeroplane. The turbaned Sikh captain at the front of the line turns angrily. Shut up, Private Diwan. Loaded like a freight train. The reedy voice rises to a shout. Flying like an aeroplane. For God's sake, somebody shut him up. The soldier in front of Private Diwan raises his rifle like a club, is about to bring it down when the sergeant intervenes. Let me handle this. He's just a boy. Sergeant Khandelkar grips the private by his thin shoulders and whispers urgently, The singing stops, and once again there is only the deep silence of the mountains. Captain Singh calls for a halt. The men drop their packs and slump into the snow. Sergeant Khandelkar's bony face is dark with worry, and he speaks in a low voice. Captain, any idea where we are? Have we crossed over into Pakistani territory? The captain shrugs. They'd left the Indian Army base camp far down the glacier 2 days ago. Maps are useless up here. Technically, India and Pakistan are not at war, but the Siachen Glacier is a gray zone between the two countries, a place of armed skirmishes and ambushes. They've been on tough missions up here, but this one is different. Complete radio silence, no helicopter evacuations, no parachute drops of ammunition. Like ghosts, they had to cross high up into Pakistani territory, hit their target, and come back undetected. The captain glances at Private Diwan. The boy is staring up into the sun with unseeing eyes. Sergeant Khandelkar leans in. Sir, I'm worried about him. It looks like high-altitude cerebral edema. His brain is swelling. He'll be hallucinating soon. They both look at Private Diwan, who's now giggling to himself. He does a little twirl in the snow, then starts humming again. The captain's face darkens. If he compromises the mission, we're going to have to leave him behind. No! Sergeant Khandelkar's voice rises to a shout, and he makes an effort to lower it. He's just a kid. We can't do that. I'll walk with him, sir. I'll keep him quiet. All right, but keep a close watch on him if he's any trouble at all. The corners of the sergeant's mouth turn down in disgust. This mission stinks, sir. We've been walking 3 days to reach a set of coordinates. Why couldn't they tell us what our target is? Captain Singh shrugs. This is how it's done these days, Sergeant. They dream up these missions down in New Delhi and we do the dirty work. The sergeant sniffs indignantly, but keeps his peace. Private Diwan is smiling blankly now. He begins to hum again, the same stupid tune from some stupid American band. Time to move on, Sergeant. Gather the men, and keep an eye on that boy. The soldiers rise slowly, pull on the heavy packs, and start walking. Captain Singh thinks he hears a noise and looks sharply up the mountain. There is nothing to see but snow. Okay. So now I'm moving on to some years later. The sea captain, whose name is Ranjit Singh, has left India under a cloud. He now lives on the island of Martha's Vineyard, where he works as a caretaker looking after rich people's houses. It's winter, and Ranjit is living in a rundown shack with his wife Pritham and his young daughter Shanti. Here's a scene where he wakes up early one morning and sits in the kitchen of his shack. Sitting at the kitchen table, Ranjit drinks chai and studies his accounts ledger, filled with additions and subtractions. Thanks to the senator's contacts, he has taken on 4 additional caretaking jobs in the last week and is happy to have the work. But the storm that hit midweek was brutal. He was forced to hire 3 of Joao's cousins to help him deal with downed trees and clogged gutters, and paying their wages has set him back badly. He has sent out invoices for the work, but he knows that the checks will take weeks to arrive. Over the summer, he's learned that money seems to be an abstraction for rich people, something with many zeros rolling onward and gathering interest. Small sums bore them. They don't make a connection between the checks they write and the food that goes into his family's stomachs. If he's going to survive this month, he desperately needs 1 or 2 of them to pay up. Papaji, it's freezing in here. Can I have some chai? Shanti stands in the doorway, barefoot, her hair falling about her face in a tangle. Are, up so early? You were shouting in your sleep, Papaji. I'm awake now. Ah, it was just a dream. Go put on a sweatshirt and socks, and I'll give you chai. When she returns, she sits across from him and drinks chai, her face half hidden by a large red mug, imitating his every move. When he slurps his tea, she slurps hers. When he says, ah, she echoes him. He can't help smiling. Come here, you, he says. She climbs into his lap and he inhales the sleepy, warm smell of his daughter. She shivers. It's freezing in here, Papaji. What happened to the heat? He looks annoyed at the silent furnace in the corner. And what's that smell? It really stinks. She wrinkles up her nose. I'll fix it, Beatty. Just a minute. She climbs off his lap, and he goes to press the reset button again. It clicks, but there's no whoosh of air, and he groans with exasperation, then remembers the tank in the basement. Could they possibly be out of heating oil? Grabbing a flashlight from the counter, he opens the door to the basement and walks down the rickety wooden stairs, the beam of light playing over broken beds, beach chairs with no seats, and an old-fashioned rolling lawnmower. The oil tank is in the corner, and as he walks toward it, he feels his feet slip and slide. Turning the flashlight downwards, he illuminates a puddle too viscous and shiny to be water. Bending down, he smells the high-octane stink of heating oil. There is a leak in the tank. All this while, oil has been puddling onto the floor, and the furnace has finally cut off. There is a lake of oil down here, and one electrical spark will set it on fire. Turning off the flashlight, he stands in the darkness and desperately tries to think. A leak like this will cost hundreds, perhaps a few thousand, to fix, and the landlord has made it clear that he doesn't want to sink another dime into this house. Could Joao help him clean up the oil and patch up the tank? He turns on his flashlight again and sees a thick yellow puddle spreading across the basement floor all the way to the far corners. Oh, this isn't like cleaning up a flooded basement. This is highly flammable oil. He's fooling himself if he thinks he can fix this. Maybe he could find another place to stay, but where? The summer people won't rent out their houses in the off-season. All the cheap motels have shut, and unlike the Cape, there are no trailer parks on the Vineyard. At this time of the year, finding another place is going to be impossible. His shoulders sag in defeat. There's only one thing to do. Pack what they can, get onto the ferry, and drive to Boston. His attempt at freedom is over. He'll have to ask Lallu, Preetham's fat uncle, to give him his old job back. He suddenly becomes aware of the heavy bunch of keys in his jacket pocket. Keys that unlock the 5 houses under his care, houses with good heating systems and comfortable beds. He thinks of one house in particular, perched on a cliff in Aquina, far from prying eyes. Maybe they can live there for a few days, perhaps a week, while he figures out what to do. He is still thinking it over as he walks back up to the kitchen. Shanti sees him and screws up her nose. Did you fix it? You really smell. What happened to your pants? Looking down, he realizes that the hems of his jeans are soaked in heating oil. Preetham stirs in the living room. What's that noise? What time is it? He walks into the living room and crouches next to the couch. Listen, the oil tank is leaking. Furnace has stopped working. The basement is flooded with oil. Oh my God, Ranjit! She sits up, her long hair loose and disarrayed. I've been telling you all this time, this house is useless. We should go back to Boston. He thinks about returning to his job at the Indian store. Back to hauling up sacks of lentils from the basement and cleaning out the weevils. Back to frying samosas in the stifling kitchen, the hot oil splattering his arms. Back to Lallu saying, well, Captain, here you are not commanding a regiment, huh? It is my shop, and you will do what I tell you. He takes a deep breath, slows the thudding of his heart, and reaches a decision. Just listen a moment, he says, his voice calm and reasonable as he lies to her. It's not that bad. We can get it fixed in a few days. And I just call a friend. He reaches into his pocket and shows her his cell phone. This friend says we can stay at his house. No problem. Friend? What friend? I'm not staying with that Joao and his sister in that filthy place. We're not staying with the Brazilians, John. This is my high-up client. His house has got 3 bedrooms and a swimming pool. The swimming pool is empty, but it's like a 5-star hotel. Preetham looks at him suspiciously. It's beautiful. Huge beds. Better than a hotel. You wait and see. You sure they will let us stay? He senses that his description appeals to her. Yes, of course. Just pack quickly. Take some clothes. I can come back for the rest of the stuff later. She shrugs off the blanket and stands. Maybe we should just go back to Boston. He holds her shoulders. For once, just trust me, okay? He turns to Shanti, who is hovering in the doorway. I need your help. Code Red. Her eyes widen. Code Red? Really? He nods. It is a game they have played since she was little, rehearsing an emergency drill in case of danger. Find the duffel bag in the closet. Take your clothes and don't forget your school things. Fast. She runs into the bedroom and he hears the thump of drawers being opened and closed. Walking past the couch, he joins Shanti in the bedroom and pulls out an old suitcase from under the bed, the Air India tags still on it. He throws in a red pouch containing their passports, along with clean clothes and turbans. Shanti is busy packing, and she doesn't notice as he slips his hand under his mattress, pulling out a long sheath made out of layers of duct tape. Inside it is a knife he has constructed, taking the blade from a kitchen knife and replacing its plastic handle with a piece of wood, wrapped in coarse rope for a better grip. It's not much of a weapon, but it is razor sharp and slips easily into his boot. Shanti finishes packing and runs outside. By the time he carries out the duffel bag and suitcase, she is already sitting in the driver's seat of the truck. As he taught her, she has turned on the engine and is swinging the steering wheel back and forth and pretending to drive. I warmed up the car. What happened? Where are we going? Scoot over. Ignoring her questions, he throws the luggage into the flatbed and climbs into the truck. Preetham gets into the back, her hair unbraided, falling loose around her shoulders. He's about to release the brake when she turns to him. Did you bring the wedding album? Why do we need that now? I mean, her mouth becomes a thin line. I'm not leaving it behind. He returns to the darkened house and finds the leather-bound album lying next to the couch. After all these years, it still smells of incense. When he returns to the truck, Preetham puts the album into her lap and looks straight ahead. Shanti is bouncing around in the front seat. It is a foggy morning, and the mist blankets the trees, turning the road into a dark smear. Flipping on the headlights, he backs the truck onto the road and heads in the direction of Aquina. Okay, the final scene is very short. It's from the middle of the book. Things have gone horribly wrong, and Ranjit is now in Boston, staying in a Fleabag hotel in Chinatown. He's on the run, being pursued by some armed men, and he realizes that it's too dangerous for him to continue wearing his turban and full beard because he's easily going to be spotted. The fluorescent light in the tiny bathroom buzzes and blinks into life. Touching the back of his head, Ranjit feels his hair matted with blood. At least his scalp has stopped bleeding. Taking off his shirt, he stands bare-chested in front of the small mirror. The glass has lost most of its silvering over the years, but the murky image that stares back at him is unmistakably that of a bearded Sikh. He unknots his hair and it falls to his waist. There are glimmers of gray in his beard that weren't there a few days ago. It does not matter now. He remembers walking through the Golden Temple with his mother. Mataji had pointed at the men bathing in the glittering waters of the Sarovar, the sacred lake. Ranjit, she had said, a Sikh never cuts his hair. Our ancestors were warriors who would rather face death than be defiled. Your turban is part of who you are. If you lose your identity, you lose yourself. You must never betray the gurus. He had looked at his reflection in the water, proud of his turban, proud to be a Sikh, and he had promised her that he would never betray his faith. He can hear his mother praying, her voice melodious and strong. Even in a gale of torrential rain, I would go to meet my guru. Even if an ocean separates them, a Sikh would go to meet his guru. As a man dies of thirst without water, a Sikh would die without his guru. Now, standing in the gloomy bathroom, he opens his eyes and looks at himself one last time. Taking a deep breath, he raises the gleaming scissors to his head. Forgive me, Mataji. His arm aches, and the bathroom floor is inches deep in thick black hair. When he's done with his scalp, he begins cutting into his beard and mustache, and soon there's only stubble. He soaps his face and shaves using the cheap plastic razor. He is clumsy and cuts himself, and the white lather on his face turns pink. When he's done, he runs a plastic comb through his hair, feeling the teeth bite into his scalp. Maybe he shouldn't have cut his hair quite so short. Now he'll have to buy some gel and spike it like he's seen in the magazines. He gathers up the drifts of hair from the floor and stuffs them into a plastic bag, all the while avoiding his reflection in the mirror. When he can delay no more, he is forced to look at himself. A stranger's face stares back from the mirror. Short, spiky hair, a long face with a strong jaw, a sharp nose, and tired eyes. And there is a scar, a thick ridge that starts under his jaw and curves to his left ear. With his beard gone, it is exposed. He turns his head away, shuts off the bathroom light, and heads to the trash chute down the corridor. Pulling open the metal flap, he throws the bag down into its dark mouth, imagining the black ropes of hair mingled with chicken bones and bloody paper towels. A part of himself will now remain forever in America. Thank you.
I was just curious why you chose a Sikh as your protagonist, whether there's anything about that in particular. And the second question is, in writing this book, do you have sort of authors who've written thrillers in the past that you've really admired and looked to them for structure and in how you wrote this book? I was just curious about that.
Okay, thank you. Those are both great questions. Actually, the Sikh as a protagonist. I remember the day after 9/11, I was living in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I went to our local grocery store, and all the checkout guys were all Sikhs, of older guys. They couldn't get other jobs, so they were all working there. And they were terrified that day. And one of these guys had an American flag stick on his turban, you know. And I thought that's so sad, you know. And part of the experience of being an immigrant is that you're both invisible, right? Like people don't really notice you, acknowledge you in a way, but you're also hyper visible. And the Sikhs are sort of so visible, you know. And so that incident stuck in my mind when I started writing the book. And then when I started researching the Siachen Glacier, there are a lot of Sikhs who are in the army, officers and soldiers. So that choice kind of made sense. As for good thrillers, I'm sure you all have read good stuff. I grew up in India actually reading thrillers. So I grew up in India in the 70s, right? And there wasn't much stuff. You could go and you could read like Kipling and really old, dusty British books. And then you had like Robert Ludlum and Ross MacDonald and stuff like that. So I read thrillers growing up. And then I came to the States, and I hadn't read like Catcher in the Rye and Great Gatsby and all that stuff. I was really ashamed. So I spent years kind of catching up on that stuff. And then I went back to thrillers like 5-6 years ago, and I found the genre had really changed. Because with the Cold War over, there's no more easy bad guys out there. The only bad guys are the North Koreans, which is why they're in my book. They're just like they're stereotypical bad guys. But the Soviet Union's gone, the Eastern Bloc is gone. So thrillers have become actually really interesting multicultural explorations. And a couple of things that I have a friend, Lisa Brackman, who's written a great book called Rock, Paper, Tiger. It's set in China. And her new book, the sequel to that, I think it's called Hour of the Rat, is coming out in a couple of days a week. She's fantastic. I don't know if you guys have read John Banville, writing as Benjamin Black. He's got a great series of mysteries that are set in Dublin in the 50s. And then John Burdett's Bangkok trilogy is really fantastic. He's a Buddhist detective, and he's completely sort of not what you'd expect a detective to be. So all those things really inspired me to kind of write a thriller.
What are your writing plans for the next few years? And will they include courses?
Will they include what, sir? Oh, courses. Oh, okay. John's a student of mine, former student. Well, it depends on, actually, I have the sequel to this book is called Bollywood Taxi. It has the same protagonist, Ranjit Singh. He's now a cab driver in New York. And he gets involved in the murder of a Bollywood actress. So I just finished writing that and sent it off to my publisher, and she seemed to think it's okay. And so with any luck, people will buy this book, and I'll publish the next one next year. And this is supposed to be a trilogy, so I have ideas for a third book as well. I have lots of ideas for books. It just depends on the publishing world. You know, as my wife will attest, I wake up in the morning, I'm like, oh, how about this? How about that? You know, it's what happens when you get your first book published at the age of 45. You know, it's so. Thank you.
Question on your setting. Why Martha's Vineyard? A lot of other possibilities. Why that one?
Thank you. That's a good question. Actually, the book kind of started in Martha's Vineyard. My wife's family has a house in Oak Bluffs, and so we're lucky enough to be able to go there over the summers. And it's a very interesting place. I know there's like a lot of stuff has been said in the Martha's Vineyard, but I think that's a reason because it's a small kind of New England island, but it has all these different worlds in it. And for me, we were kind of sitting out on the deck and having a beer, and a guy came over. He lives next door, and he's a caretaker. He looks after people's houses. And he started telling me about all these amazing houses that are lying empty 8-9 months of the year. You know, they have screening rooms, they have swimming pools, and nobody lives there. So he goes and watches the Super Bowl. He watches a different game in different houses. He has friends over for a beer. You know, it's like, and I was like, wow, that's a really interesting premise for a book, you know? And so that kind of stuck in my mind. And the second thing with the Vineyard is another incident. I walked into a grocery store. I think it was in Vineyard Haven. And this kid, blonde kid in the aisle, he works there. He's got a tag on. And I said, "Where's the salt?" He's like, "Salt? What is salt?" And I say, "You're kidding. I thought it was a joke." But it turned out he's from Poland. And so in the summer, we have all this migrant labor that comes there. They're from Poland, all over Eastern Europe, Brazil, Jamaica, you know. And I was like, wow, that's amazing, because this is a very New England kind of experience, and yet all the labor is from all over the world. And I started thinking, like, what would happen if one of these guys just stayed on, you know, wanted to stay on. So that's really the Vineyard connection.
You talked about writing a lot and revision, and also dividing that with research, like on the glacier. Did you do research here, and how did you know when you've done enough research and you had to keep the writing going?
Right. Yeah. Research. In this book, because we've been to the Vineyard a lot during the summer, we actually went back in the winter, and it's a completely different place. I mean, everybody's gone. It's really amazing how different it feels. And we'd go in the off season and walk around. So that was the research in terms of the Vineyard was easy. I've also lived in Boston for close to 20 years. So the Indian store in Central Square, the Barker Center, MIT, these are all from my life. So I kind of took them and modified them a little bit. The Siachen Glacier stuff was interesting. It's a war that's been going on for over a decade, and it's the highest war in the world, but people don't really know about it. And I just happened to be in a secondhand bookstore, and I picked up a book. There's this beautiful black and white, self-published books by this guy, this photographer who'd gone and shot the conflict from both sides. And it was really amazing to me to see those pictures. They've completely ruined the glacier. They have pipes of kerosene to transport kerosene that have leaked, and they parachute in all their supplies. So these parachutes freeze in these giant columns, and there's these columns of garbage on the glaciers. And so I really got interested with that. And then I just started researching the glacier. Of course, you can't really go there. So it was all through finding footage and photographs and stuff like that, and kind of extrapolating from that. In terms of, I think there was another question. Part of the question was writing and revision. I actually have a writing process now, at least I hope. But this was my first book that I wrote, so I just thought I was writing literary suspense. And then when I sold it, my editor, I remember she said this to me. She said, "Could you just take the thriller stuff and just spread it through like peanut butter?" And I was like, oh. So then I went back and I did rewriting and met with her and ran stuff by her and rewrote. Because with a thriller, there's my instinct is to be literary and slow down and to look at things and think about things, but you got to keep the pace going. So that's something I learned painfully.
Now, I believe you've published some literary short stories under your first name, Amin, and now this book appears under AX. Are you, like John Banville, whom you mentioned, going to maintain separate identities, one for more literary work and one for thrillers?
That's a really, you completely nailed it. I mean, John Banville in his Benjamin Black books, he wears a hat, right? He's wearing a fedora. Maybe I need a fedora just to make it clear what mode I'm in, so people can greet me appropriately. No, it was an interesting experience because I was publishing literary short stories in literary journals, and then agents would email me, "Hey, I loved your story. You got anything?" And I would say, "Yeah, I'm working on a thriller." Dead silence. No response. They're like, no, sorry, we're not interested in a thriller. And I began to realize, there's somewhat of a division between the literary world and then the thriller world. So I said, okay, I'll just call myself something different, so people won't get confused, and so you know what it is you're picking up. Is it thriller? Is it literary stuff? So we'll see how it works. I mean, that works for Banville, but he's won the Booker, I believe. So yeah.
I mean, one of the things that I think makes the thriller very literary is the characterization of Ranjit and the idea of loneliness, the immigrant experience as being very lonely. And it struck me that in The Caretaker, he's a caretaker, which is by definition a lonely job. And you just mentioned Bollywood Taxi, where again, he's a taxi driver, which again, you're in a cab on your own a lot of the time. So I wondered about whether you infused the book with your own experiences about loneliness as an immigrant in America, and whether you were thinking about that when you were thinking about the kinds of jobs that Ranjit would be doing.
Thank you. Wow. Well, I certainly wrote myself into a corner, right? Because I have this guy in this book, the caretaker. He's a caretaker in the off season in Martha's Vineyard, which may be a reason why one morning I sat down, I had a strong cup of coffee, and the ghost appeared, right? And I was like, oh, he's got to talk to somebody. So the kind of ghost appeared, and then I had to kind of figure out what to do with him and work it in. But I think that being an immigrant can be a pretty lonely experience, and I certainly drew from my own sort of emotional experiences while writing the book. That being said, however, in my second book, Ranjit's a cab driver, but he has a lot of friends. He has a whole slew of Bangladeshi and Pakistani cabbie friends, and they're always talking on the phone and stuff. And funnily enough, it was a more fun. It was slightly easier book to write. It wasn't easy, but it was a little easier because I had people to work with. But just being a Sikh, it kind of sets. It definitely does set him apart, and then he becomes kind of a magnet for all kinds of emotions and responses, and that can often be interesting. So, thank you. Thank you.
So you just said that the second book was easier to write, and I wanted to go back to that question. Do you know who Lena Dunham is? She's a writer for this HBO series, and
Yeah.
something she said really struck me. She said, the first season was really easy to write because all of your stories that you've been building up in your mind all your life, it just
Right.
hits the page. So I'm just wondering, you just finished the second novel. Was that process, you said it was easier, but was it vastly different from writing the first book? Knowing that you were going to have the first book published, did it change the craft in any way?
It's actually interesting. I had a lot of the second book written before I got a deal for the first book, because I just finished the first book, and I said, what am I going to do? I got nothing to do. I wake up in the morning. It's like, okay, I am calling myself a writer, so what do I do? I go write. So I just started the second book. So in a way, it's when you're writing a series, it's and we'll see if it works or not, because you want a reader to come into the second book in the series and find it a fulfilling experience without having read the first book. So you have to put in some backstory very subtly, and that I found was challenging to write. Anybody's first novel, I think, is, you're right, they have all their stories are built up and it kind of comes out onto the page, but it might be a little harder to control. And in the second book, I actually had a sense of what I could control and what I couldn't control. So I was a little bit more aware of what I was doing. It was still painful. I still got depressed. I still called up my friends and complained to them, and considered, this is a conversation I have with my wife all the time, like, how can I go back to architecture? Like, the technology's evolved. I don't remember how to do window flashings anymore, So there was definitely a lot of that. Thanks. Hello.
So about your life as an architect before, I was curious if you could talk about that decision to totally switch gears and drop your life as an architect and pursue that passion of writing. That's a courageous act, and just curious about that decision.
Thank you. That's a great question. We heard an old R&B singer and she's in her 60s. Betty Levette, anybody know Betty Levette, right? And she said, oh, she's an overnight success now, and she's like in her mid 60s. So I've been writing my whole life, but being a good immigrant kid here, I never like felt like I could just sit down and write. And I've been writing for about 10, 12 years. I've written 2 novels before this one that are just kind of in the drawer. So when I decided to stop working and write full time, I had been writing a lot. So it wasn't sort of like, oh, I'm going to be a modern dancer. Let's see what happens. Or I'll be an astronaut. You know, I felt like, okay, I've put in all this time. And being an architect with you know, a BlackBerry and having a construction site that's happening in real time, buildings are going up, you know. If something goes wrong, somebody gets killed or you go over schedule, it's like so many thousands of dollars a day. It's not really conducive to writing, you know. I know lawyers who manage to write books. I don't know how to do that. The only other architect I know who's written a book is Arundhati Roy, and I'm not sure if she was practicing at the time. So I literally had done a lot of writing, and then I really decided, okay, if I'm going to make a go of this, I need to stop working as an architect for a while and take a break. But the idea was like I'd take 2 years and see what happens, and if not, you know, I'll probably go back and be doing window details. So.
Just to follow up a little bit on that, had you had anything published before while you were an architect? And also, once you made the transition to becoming a full-time writer, can you talk a little bit about the process of writing a book? You mentioned that you sat downstairs and did a lot of writing, but I think that you were in a writing group. And can you talk a little bit about that, the actual process of you know, going from somebody who sort of writes for themselves to somebody who's having things published?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so about 6 years ago in Cambridge, I'd written a lot of stuff, but I never sent out anything because I never thought like, hey, who's gonna, you know, I'm not good enough, I can't send out stuff. And I met with a friend who's an editor at a literary magazine, and she said, hey, what are you working on? And I said, well, there's this essay I've been working on for 10 years about my family's house in Calcutta. And she said, well, let me take a look at it. And I sent it to her, and she published it in Harvard Review. And I was like, wow, you know, that's me, you know. And so I had 3 copies of Harvard Review, and I kept it on a shelf in my closet. And then I started sending out to more and more literary magazines, and started getting published. And that really gave me kind of courage to start, you know, thinking of myself as a writer. It's a very strange thing because, I mean, at what point are you a writer? Does somebody come by and say, oh, you're a writer today? Like, you're a writer now? Like, what point do you call the threshold, you know? You feel like an imposter for a large part of the way. But so we still have that shelf in my closet, and every time I get a literary magazine or something, I put 2 copies of The Caretaker up there, and I have all my literary magazines. And then, you know, the days when like I think like, oh, I'm not a writer, I just open the closet, I look at it, I'm like, okay, all right, you know, that's how it goes. In terms of writing a book, yeah, there's a lot of work, but community is key. You know, I was lucky enough to be in Boston. There's a wonderful writing center there called Grub Street, and I really learned there with a whole cohort of people. There were 12 of us, and I think 8 of us have books either published or coming out, which is amazing. And it's like evening classes, people have jobs. And when I came here, I was lucky enough to be plugged into the Writers Center, which is in Bethesda. And I've taught there, and a lot of my friends are from there. So I think community is really key to surviving a writing process of a novel. And I definitely could not have done this without folks in my writing group, many of whom are here, who read entire novels and were like, no, this is not working, that's not working, you know, in a very nice way. So there's that period of isolation of just going off into a room, but then coming out and having people that you really trust. And I think we really trust each other with our work. So that's really important. But.
Well, thank you. We have books in the back. And
Thank you.